Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Arehart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition of the Meetup, our 270th, yep, thank you for that kind comment there, Ron. It'll be me. I'll be your host and your speaker, and I'll talk about differences between ColdFusion Enterprise and Standard more than you may think. And this is being recorded on Thursday, September 10th, 2020 at noon Eastern. And I also want to point out that all our sessions are recorded. You see at the URL at the bottom, it's really simply recordings.coldfusionmeetup.com. Let me switch now to the presentation. I'll just take a second. So sorry for that. I'll edit that out. So, yep, the talk will be that title, and you can reach out to me with for information if you have questions, follow up, either my email address there, chart.org, or at Arehart, and that'll be offered on all the slides as well. So if you don't notice it now, perhaps you'll notice it later. And so, yeah, bottom line, prepare to be surprised. I suspect from my many years, 20+ years of working with ColdFusion, that most people could probably only name a couple or maybe a few differences between ColdFusion Enterprise and ColdFusion Standard, but there really are dozens, a couple dozen. And yes, there's a big cost difference, but part of the reason why I want to have this presentation is to say that you may find that it's worth it, that the cost difference either is worth it for the benefits it gives you, or I may show you later that the benefits are worth it for you when you understand how the two are licensed. It might actually be cheaper to license Enterprise. Yeah. And you might be able to save money from that or from some other performance benefits that I hope you see, or also some other licensing matters that may surprise you. I've actually helped people save from buying licenses that they didn't need. So we'll get back to that towards the end. And like I said, if anything else, you might learn something that'll save your bacon. Something that maybe because you're on Standard has been hurting your performance, driving down like a parking brake. And to be clear, I'm not here to sell Enterprise. I mean, I help people pick whichever is the right one for them. And I don't sell it, I just help people. That's all I do. And I'm just saying, you might benefit from it, you might not need it. That's my whole goal, is to help you understand that. And so, quickly, who am I? Some of you know, but perhaps some don't. I'm just an independent consultant. I don't work for anybody. I don't represent anybody in particular. I'm just a CF fan like most of you, and sometimes defender of it for those who are not fans. And there's some people here, probably here or watching this, who are looking at this for evidence of what's wrong with ColdFusion and it shouldn't cost money. And that's another whole subject. Really, this isn't the place to have that debate. But the point is, if you either choose to or have to or want to buy ColdFusion, then I'm here to talk about what the differences are. And what I do for a living is help people primarily troubleshoot servers, whether ColdFusion or Lucee or other Java application servers. So most of my days really spent troubleshooting, and sometimes I help people find out that a problem is either caused by something in Standard that's lifted in Enterprise, or I might help them see an opportunity to leverage a feature that's in Enterprise and not in Standard, or I might even help them avoid leveraging a feature that they thought was going to be the answer for them, and it turned out it isn't. I'll just give you a preview of that. Most people know that multiple instances are a feature of Enterprise, and a lot of people think that's our answer. We need multiple instances. That'll fix our problem. But when you do the right diagnostics and digging into things, you may find out, no, that's not going to solve the problem at all, because the problem has nothing to do with what that solves. So anyway, we'll come back to that a bit later. But that's a little quick intro to who I am. And the presentation slides will be available after the session on my site, which again, if you look at the bottom right corner, arehart.org. Excuse me. All right, so I'm going to do something that a salesperson would never do, because I'm not a salesperson. We're going to talk about the price right up front. See, most people would go through and talk about the advantages of something and then saying, here, if you want those benefits, here's the cost. And that's not where I'm coming from. So let's just get it out of the way. Yes, the list price of ColdFusion Standard is $24.99 US, and the list price of CF Enterprise is $94.99 US. And yeah, that means that Standard is, or Enterprise is almost 4 times the price. Not quite, but almost 4 times the price. So what do you get for those differences, right? That's the crux of this presentation. I'll point out as well that you can get discounts. There is a discount for upgrading from the prior release. So right now, if you were on 2016, you get a discount if you upgrade from 2016 to 2018. So I'm saying those prices are the A, they're the list price, and B, they're the full license price. C, if you are upgrading, you get a discount, and you can go to the Adobe website and find that, or I'll show you another site in a moment that shows prices even more easily. And we'll see if things change when 2020 comes out. Adobe never announces in advance anything about pricing, let alone about additions and what's going to be in or not in. And some of the things we'll talk about later is things that used to be in enterprise that no longer are. And sometimes they announce that that's another benefit of the change of the version, is they've moved a feature from enterprise down to standard. So again, even if you're not interested in buying enterprise, that's not why we're here. I want to help. If you're on standard, I want you to help learn what maybe you could leverage that you didn't think you could, and also help you see what things might be limited for you that would be lifted if you went to enterprise, and you can make that call yourself. So anyway, I also wanted to point out, as far as pricing is concerned, you can almost always get a discount by going to a reseller. And one reseller some of you may know about, the makers of Fusion Reactor, have long had a site called buy-adobe-software.com, and recently they got the buy-cf.com domain. So either one of those will get you there. And that site lists all the prices of the various versions of standard and enterprise, upgrade, and so on. So I'll leave you to look into that on your own. Now, I was trying to get confirmation of this, and let me just look real quick because just today and yesterday, some news broke. Yep, just a second. I got an email and okay. So yes, so some of you may have heard in recent days and weeks that Integral, the makers of Fusion Reactor, who run those websites, had a 25% discount, and it was being said that it was a discount for upgrading ColdFusion, with the implication being that it was for 2016, 2018. And that was nice, 25% off. But it turns out it's actually different. Check this out. This is very important. It's 25% off to upgrade to 2018 from 9, 10, or 11. And that's really amazing, because for years, Adobe didn't even let you upgrade. It wouldn't let you buy an upgrade from an earlier version. Wouldn't give you, well, it wouldn't give you a discount. You had to pay full price for 2018 to go to 11, to go from 11, and conversely to go to 2016 from 10, and to go to 11 from 9. You used to not be able to do that. So this is really awesome. And I don't think it's full, I don't think it's permanent. I think it's for some period of time, perhaps weeks. So anyway, keep an eye on that, but that's pretty cool. And then otherwise, once that program ends, it's 5% off pretty much any license, upgrade or full. So yeah, check out the website for more. I just want to highlight that when you are talking about buying, that's a great site to be paying attention to. All right, let's move on to the differences now. And so first, we're going to talk about the major differences, the most notable things that are in enterprise only. And again, I think if most people were asked, the number one thing they would think of is, yeah, multiple instances and clustering. So this is the ability for you to create multiple instances of ColdFusion on a single machine. So traditionally, when you would install ColdFusion, you'd have one instance, and that was it. And in fact, with standard, if you tried to install it again, it would not let you. You can't install it more than once. And same with enterprise. Technically, you can't install the server edition more than once. But with enterprise, once you've installed it, you'll then see that there's something called the instance manager. And let's just hop over there real quick. I've got a browser set up here, ready to demonstrate stuff. There you go. So this is I happen to be in a developer edition. We'll talk about this later. The developer edition and the enterprise edition are nearly identical. There are differences, and I'll talk about that later. But anyway, insofar as this feature is concerned, when you look on the left, down here, there's something that's, and there's supposed to be a pop-up here, but since it's not popping up, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but you can click on this hamburger menu, and it will show you stuff. Now, actually, my browser seems to be locking up. Let me refresh this and make sure there's no problem. There you go. So now it should work. Okay, so first of all, if you click on the hamburger menu, it does expand things out, and eventually you get used to knowing what button's what, but also when you mouse over it, it should pop up. And it's funny, this happened on the last session. It's in the middle of my screen. It says Enterprise Manager. It shouldn't be there. It should be right next to it. But anyway, the point is, this is the Enterprise Manager. And you won't see that button in standard at all. But in enterprise, you'll see that button, and it's got 2 sections to it. And if you're new to the CF 2018, administrator, let me just show you that, if you were looking for scheduled tasks, it used to be on the left under the first menu called settings. Well, now that first menu is a button, and across the top of the screen, these are the things that used to be submenus. It's a little bit different, but that's the way it works, and there they are. Also, I want to point this out to people, you can come up here and just search for stuff. So if I just clicked in here and searched for tasks, it would find scheduled tasks. So bam, you can just go right to it. So anyway, let's go back to the instance manager. So here I am on the instance manager, and normally you'd see nothing but the one CFusion default instance, and it tells you its name and where it is and the port for getting to typically the administrator, and if you were going to use a connection from IIS or Apache, this is the AJP port, and so on. So anyway, you can create a new instance, and literally, if you've never done it, it's so trivial. You just come in here and give it a name. So if I want to call it test2, and then I can and I'll just tell you, I always recommend people hit the tab key in their browser because there's JavaScript underlying it. And notice it popped in and put the word test2 at the end of the name there. I happen to store ColdFusion on D drive. Anyway, and then you have the option to enable a service if you want to or not, your call. But I'm going to go ahead and do that. And this is going to take a couple moments and create an instance. So literally in just a minute, if that, perhaps seconds, it just depends on a couple of variables, I'll have a new instance and it will now be there, and it won't be running by default. And on that list, that previous screen was a list of the instances and buttons on the left. One of the buttons would be to start it, or I could go into Windows services in my case, I'm on Windows, or it would set up a Linux service. Anyway, or on Mac. Anyway, the point is you can control it through that interface, you can control it through services. It's a separate instance. That's what matters. In fact, let me get back to this. So it's a separate instance with its own administrator, its own JVM, its own service, if that's what you choose to do. And you can stop one and run another. And the bigger point is you can cluster and load balance instances. So not only could you have more than one, but you could tell that same screen had a cluster manager. I could say, I want to create a cluster. I can call it Bob. And it's made up of those 2 instances called test1 and test2. And that would create inside of CF a mechanism that says, okay, let's regard these guys as being a cluster to each other. And then you have the ability when you set up that cluster to replicate sessions between them or to enable what's called sticky sessions. And this talk is not about all, I think, this whole path. We've got too many things to talk about. I'm just saying that these are features. And just so you know, that ability to replicate sessions does rely on you and require you enabling J2E sessions in the CF admin memory variable. So if you're not using that, you'd have to switch to that. But if you are using J2E sessions, yes, you can replicate them when you create multiple instances. And there's pros and cons. Like I said, I don't want to get into this in too much depth, but I'm just like, one of the things is I'll say, if you create a new instance and you're running low on memory, you might now, I mean, it takes what the previous instance, the CFusion one had, and if it was set to 4 gig, and you had 8 gig on the box, and you create a second instance, well, now 2 of your instances think they can use 4 gig. And if you create 3 of them think they can use 4 gig. And if you only have 8 gig, soon you're going to run out of memory. I'm not saying that's a con, but you need to be aware of these things. That's all I'm getting at is, don't just go doing these things, understand it, study it a little bit, look for help from someone like me. I do it all the time. But I also want to say, as I was saying earlier, if the problem is that your CF requests are hanging up talking to a database, well, creating multiple instances ain't going to solve your problem, because the multiple instances, if they all share the same database, which they might in a clustered environment, right? They'd be sharing the same database. Well, then they're all going to hang up in both instances. Now, of course, then you could go to replicated databases, or you can have different databases and do all kinds of stuff. Again, we can't get into all that. This isn't an architecture talk. I'll just say that if you're interested in this topic, go check out the docs. I offer these links here. And again, you'll get the presentation online after we're done. You'll be able to follow that link, or just Google it using multiple server instances. You will find that if you Google that phrase, it'll come up. And it's a pretty substantial set of documentation on that feature. Now, I do want to point out, as somebody might be wanting to say, is you certainly can do clustering and load balancing without CF, of course. You could even do that with standard. Now, you can't have more than one standard on one machine, but you could have standards on 2 different machines and use some cluster load balancing feature that's not inside of CF And that could cluster those two instances, absolutely. You can't do session replication because that is a feature that's only enabled through this. And now I'm gonna show you an alternative to that. Well, I'll add it now, here you go. If you didn't know this, check this out, especially if you're on CF Standard or Enterprise. Either of you may appreciate this. 2016, not 2018, 2016 added the option for you to use a Redis session store to hold your sessions. So yeah, session variables don't have to just be in memory. They could be in memory and in effect backed up to and shared by way of a Redis session data store that you either set up in your environment or as a service. There's available services, including free ones. Redis Labs, check that out. So anyway, that's available in all editions. One gotcha about this to be aware of before you get too excited. The way Adobe designed it, you cannot be using J2E sessions that feature in the memory variables page of the admin. So you have to use J2E sessions to use the replication feature of ColdFusion clustering. You cannot be using the J2E sessions to use the Redis session store. Don't ask me why. I don't really see why, but that's what they did, and it is what it is. All right, let's move on. The next big feature, if you ask people, typically these days, what else is, what are you getting for when you pay for Enterprise? And this may not float your boat, or it may be the answer to your problems, and that's the API Manager. The ColdFusion, it's called the ColdFusion API Manager. It's only licensed with CF Enterprise 2016 and above, but it's not written in ColdFusion, and it's not running on ColdFusion. It's just packaged with it, licensed with it. It's even got its own installer. Technically has virtually nothing to do with ColdFusion. It's got some integration with it, sure. But the point is, somebody could use the API Manager and never use ColdFusion. And it's kind of interesting because I've always felt that Adobe, probably missed the opportunity to sell it to more people, because when they saw the word ColdFusion, they said, well, we don't use ColdFusion, so we're not going to use it. They must have had their reasons. I know they're smart people. I trust that, but it's just a shame. Anyway, I'm trying to tell you that you don't need to be using it with ColdFusion, and it is not using ColdFusion, but it is a beneficial thing. It adds all kinds of stuff. If you do API development and serving of APIs and even calling out to APIs, it adds, especially for serving them up, it adds API versioning and lifecycle management and rate limiting and throttling and monitoring and access control and caching and a developer portal, SOAP to REST translation, a SOAP gateway, and a whole lot more. So if you're interested in it, again, this is not a talk about the API Manager. This, again, is a substantial part of the documentation. And it's sad because so many people say the ColdFusion docs suck and they look for something and they only find, 2 pages on it. Well, that's typically the reference manual. You don't want to learn something from a reference manual if you don't know about it. That's like trying to learn a language from a dictionary. You really need more than just the dictionary. So there's a developing ColdFusion applications guide that's 2,000 pages and got a lot of cool stuff. There's configuring and administrating. That's what the previous link pointed to. This is an API Manager guide, and it's called Getting Started with the API Manager. So if you're interested in it, check it out. It's a lot of cool stuff in there, and it branches off to even more stuff for you can learn about. Also, the last session of the CF Meetup 2 weeks ago was by Dan Wilson, and it was on his perspectives and introduction to the API Manager from late August 2020. So check that out. Are there alternatives to this? Yes, they are, but as Dan commented, they tend to be very expensive. They tend to be very, very expensive. I mean, when you look at ColdFusion Enterprise costing $10,000, you might go, man, that's expensive. But if you're in the market for an API Manager and you look at the ones that are out there, 10,000 is it's like the maintenance cost for one of the other ones. It's crazy. So anyway, check that out. All right, moving on. And I'm keeping an eye on the chat, so if anybody has anything, feel free to drop in the chat. I'll try to address it. So the next major difference I would want to point out that's in Enterprise only, and I think it's lamentable, is the Security Code Analyzer, right? So this came out with CF 2016, and it's a feature that can scan your CFML code to find vulnerabilities of all sorts, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, you name it. And it recommends the changes you should make, which is really pretty cool. Again, it was added in CF 2016, so it's there in 2018 as well. It works via CFBuilder. Now that's a gotcha to some people. They go, I don't use CFBuilder. Well, I've been telling people for 4 years, well, if you have Enterprise, you can use CFBuilder just for the purpose of doing the scanning, okay? Just, you don't have to live in it as a developer. Just use it to do this job. And when you're done, close it and move on to whatever editor you favor. But here's the kicker, is that it requires enterprise. And by the way, whereas everybody says developer is the same as enterprise, I'm going to tell you today it's not true. There's differences, and this is one of them. The ColdFusion Builder security code analyzer does not work if you connect it to a ColdFusion Developer Edition. It must be enterprise. Can't be standard, can't be developer, must be enterprise. So there you go. Be aware of that. I think that's lamentable because it really should be something that's available to everybody. I really don't understand this decision when security is so important, but again, it is what it is. Anyway, back to learning more about it, check out this page, which is all about the security enhancements, but specifically talks about a major part of it is the security code analyzer. Now, what if you're, oh, sorry, does this, no, free version of CFBuilder? That's an interesting question. I don't know if it does. So let's talk quickly about that. ColdFusion Builder is also a commercial product, but just like with ColdFusion, where if you don't put in a key after 30 days, ColdFusion reverts to the developer edition. Well, with ColdFusion Builder, if you install it after 60 days, if you don't put in a key, it reverts to something called the Express edition. And it just removes certain features. And again, this talk is not about that, but Drew brought it up, good question. That free Express edition of Builder is one of the things that it removes, the ability to talk to the security, do the security code analyzer. I don't know. I wish I'd looked into that. I'm sorry I didn't. But if anybody knows, feel free to chime in. If anybody looks into it, this can be another option. Of course it does. I'll get to other options in a second, but I can't tell if GC, oh, GC's, yeah, I'm going to talk about that next, GC. But Drew, when you say, of course it does, are you answering your own question? So anyway, I'll wait to see what you guys say. But moving on, and by the way, let me back up. I'm going to show you later that you get ColdFusion Builder for free with ColdFusion. If you buy it, you get it for free. And the number of them you get depends on whether you buy enterprise or standard. So that's a bonus. We'll get back to that later. But anyway, moving on to that next point that GC was bringing up, and I was just about to when Drew dropped in his question, is I'm showing you, are there alternatives to these things that are enterprise only? And yeah, in the case of security code analysis, there's an excellent alternative called Fixinator from Pete Freitag and Foundeo, and GC shared the link to fixinator.app. That's more specifically directly to it. And so that's a very different tool in how it works. It has nothing to do with Builder, does not require a particular version of ColdFusion, and also works with Lucee, but it's not free. It's a commercial service, but for what it does, you might find it's very much well worth that cost. And not only does it do the same sort of identifying of vulnerabilities and recommending of suggested fixes, but there's even an option if you tell it to go ahead and do the change. Thank you very much. Make my life easier. And that's not everybody's cup of tea. They don't want to have a tool making changes, but it offers to back things up and all that. So I'll leave you to investigate that. Either go to foundeo.com or fixinator.app. Awesome. Okay, so let's move on. And Drew said, no, it removed the security piece in the Express version. So I guess you're saying you found that out after you asked the question, or maybe you were just testing me. Anyway, we got our answer. I wasn't sure. Got our answer now. All right, cool. Thank you. Moving on, the next major difference that you should be aware of, and you don't hear many people talk about this because it's new in CF 2018. Again, it's enterprise only, and that is this ability in CF to extend the caching features that CF has had since CF 9 beyond, and in fact, it had older caching features too, but it had a lot of new caching features in 9, and those were based on EH cache. So CF 9 and above have EH cache and still do. But now in enterprise, you have the option to change to have the caching stored in Redis or memcached, which is pretty cool for those that understand caching, wanted the caching perhaps to not be in the same environment as their CF, because the CH cache is in memory in the same JVM. So the caching, if it's too much, it's taken away from your heap. Eventually it fills it up. With a thing like Redis or memcached, it's a separate service, separate address space. It could even be on another box, could be in a different network, could be a service, like I said earlier, with the Redis storage of session variables. There's third-party tools. The cloud vendors have Redis implementations, features of the cloud service. So anyway, the point is you can now tell ColdFusion, just like with the data source, all you got to do is tell the administrator, yeah, store them over there. Your code doesn't change. It's just like with the data source. You just say the name of the data source and the admin says where to find the database. Same thing with the caching. Your code doesn't change. You just either change in the admin or you can change it in the application level. So there is provision in the application level to name what the caching mechanism should be and let that sink in. That means you could have some apps, and you can have some apps using Redis, other apps using EHCache, maybe other apps using Memcache, whatever floats your boat. Pretty cool, right? And then also, something else that was added in 2018 is another option separate from Memcache, separate from Redis, and separate from EHCache called JCS, Java Caching Service. And that JCS is now built into CF and is another option in all editions, okay? So if you're interested in this stuff that I'm talking about here, there's a page with, again, substantial discussion of it. It was a blog post from Adobe back then. So I'll leave you to check that out. All right, and then another major difference in enterprise, which may for some people be the, if some of the things I've said started to tickle you, this could be perhaps the thing that pushes you over the edge and going, oh my gosh, this is the answer to our problems. Didn't know it was even an option. In the CF Administrator mail page, there are features that affect the throughput of mail processing, CF mail, sending mail. For instance, there's a mail delivery threads, a maximum number of simultaneous threads used to deliver mail. And people have found that when they've tweaked that to do a larger number, if they're sending large amounts of mail, the mail goes out in seconds, where before it took minutes or worse, maybe hours, depending on the volumes you're creating. There's also an option called spool mail for delivery to, and the default is disk. But in enterprise, you can go to memory. And you might go, wouldn't that be the same as just disabling the spooling? No, it's not. Disabling the spooling means make mail be synchronous. You do a CF mail, it has to wait till it gets delivered, not delivered, but sent out of CF to the SMTP server, and then the next line of code can continue. That's if you disable spooling. We're talking about spooling to memory. It's different than the traditional built-in feature, which is, if you ever paid attention to it, when you do a CF mail under the covers, it really creates a file in a mail spool folder under ColdFusion, and that file is the email, and then a mechanism wakes up every 15 seconds by default, and if it finds any, it sends it out. This would take it out of being on disk to being in memory, and of course that could be faster. Now, converse is, if CF happens to crash before all the mail got delivered, it being in memory means the mail's gone. So it's not the reliable solution, it's just a performance solution, which might suit some people's needs. But back to this is something that, anybody in an enterprise who sends a lot of email, they would want to do this. Whether they want to do this, that's your call. And then there's maximum number of message to spool to memory, which is another twist on that previous one. How many to spool to memory before it starts to disk spool. So that's nice. You might say, well, I'll let it do 100 to memory, but boy, beyond 100, I'm a little worried that they might get something will crash before it finishes. So let's spool those to disk. Anyway, I'll leave you to play with that. Will Genovese did a nice blog entry on this subject where he talked about all this. And so you can learn more about it from him. You can learn more about it in the docs of ColdFusion as well, but there was no good one that I could point to. This is a better thing to point you to. Now, here's an interesting thing. This is only in enterprise, not in the developer edition. So again, like the security code analyzer, you don't get to play with this in development. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because in development, you shouldn't be sending large volumes of mail, right? Because you're obviously not using it from development. So anyway, that's their decision, Adobe's decision, and they've said these features are only in enterprise, and they truly are only in enterprise. If you went to your CF administrator to the mail page, you would not see these three choices unless you're on enterprise. That's all there is to it. And then I'll just say that as you read about the differences among different docs, saying what's in standard, what's in enterprise, there are things that suggest that backup mail servers and mail connection, maintain connection to email, are also enterprise only. I don't find that to be the case. Now, I happen to be looking at developer here, but let me just show you what I'm talking about. And I have a standard machine set up, but it's on another machine, and I was having some difficulty just before we started getting connected to that. So I'm going to just skip showing you that because, well, actually, I will show you for something else important later. But anyway, I'll just take my word for it. This backup mail servers and this maintain connection to mail server, there are things that imply that that's enterprise only, but I found it in standard. I have a standard version of CF and it's there. So you may find it's there as well. So that's good enough. Okay. All right, now that was, a bunch of the major differences. There are a bunch of other less notable differences that you should at least know about. Some are administrator oriented. One is if you use DB2 or Oracle or Sybase, the Enterprise Edition includes drivers for that. Now, let me explain. People sometimes don't understand what's going on under the covers. Adobe licenses drivers primarily from Data Direct, who are a vendor, now owned by Progress, I believe. And for years, they've built drivers for all, SQL Server, lots of drivers, and Adobe licenses those. So what you get when you buy ColdFusion is built-in Data Direct drivers. And in Enterprise Only, they provide the drivers for DB2, Oracle, and Sybase. Now, technically, as an alternative, you absolutely can go out and find third-party JDBC drivers for these, just like you can find for MySQL, like you can find for SQL Server. And there's times when some people prefer to use those over the ones built into CF. They are different. The ones built into CF are from Data Direct. The ones you get from third parties, especially the database vendors, that's their own driver. And there may be pros and cons to the choices. That's not the point of this presentation. Just saying what's built in to Enterprise are these three as additional. And the Enterprise Edition offers what's called JE2 Enterprise Edition. Now it's just called Java Enterprise Edition deployment of apps and of CF itself and or CFML as EAR or WAR files. Now, again, that's a whole subject I've written about for years, and I've got old posts I need to resurrect because sometimes this interests people. The point is it's not new. CF's been doing it since 6, but it's enterprise only, the ability to deploy CF and CFML as EAR or WAR files. Now, you might go, that sounds like esoteric crap that doesn't affect me. Well, it does affect you if you use command box. If you use command box and you've wondered why you can't use ColdFusion standard license for production use of command box, it's because under the covers, the way command box is written, it leverages this EAR WAR file deployment concept to make it be able to do the cool stuff that it does. Well, unfortunately, that can't be used with standard license. So you can't use a standard license for production for command box. Doesn't affect development, of course. Doesn't affect Enterprise. Years ago, the Oracle driver, Marant. So Marant got bought by Data Direct, I think, and then Data Direct got bought by Progress. I didn't want to go too far back in the history. And they limited the concurrent connections to 5. Are these new drivers allowed more than 5? Well, I will say I've not heard that being a limit. And I think people on Enterprise would have screamed bloody murder if the Enterprise drivers that are only in Enterprise for Oracle had such a limit. So I would say the answer should be no, but I'll leave you to investigate or anybody else who has a word to share. All right, moving on to other admin-oriented enterprise-only features. Check this out. If you're into WebSockets, Enterprise adds the ability to cluster WebSockets. What does that mean? For instance, you could publish a message to all subscribers across all nodes of a clustered setup. So you might have multiple machines with WebSockets, and you want things to be, in effect, clustered among those different instances of CF on the same machine, cross machines. So anyway, I'll leave you to read about that if you're interested in that subject. There's literally a checkbox in the administrator on the WebSockets page that's only there in Enterprise, and I believe in Developer as well, that says cluster WebSockets. And if you want to learn more about it, there's an article on using WebSockets, and I've provided here the anchor specifically to the section on clustering WebSockets. So if you're interested in that, again, you'll see the recording later. You can get that link and you can do that. Lastly, as an administrative-oriented feature, Solaris is listed in the docs as being enterprise only. I haven't tested that. I wish I could have. I just didn't get to. So I don't know if that is truly enterprise only, or if it was just a leftover. Back in 9 and 10, we never ran into connection with Oracle. Don't know about the newer version. Well, again, I wouldn't expect the newer version to impose new limits. So I wouldn't expect this is going to be the issue. But that was Mark saying that separately from Drew. So, you guys check it out, find out. I'm not aware of that. Again, the whole point of enterprise is to lift limits, and we'll get to those in just a moment. There are limits. But before we do, some coding-oriented enterprise-only features. So I'm trying to list to you guys, for those who think there's only a couple differences, there's a lot. Let's keep going. There's PDF DDX support in the CFPDF tag that was added in CF11. That's only enterprise. There's ORM text search for those that use ORM, the ability to do text searching against ORM, and that's available since CF10. Solar, if you do Solar, that's a text search engine built into CF9 and above. There's particularly their data import handler that facilitates getting stuff into it. You can still get stuff into it through CF Index and the admin, but there's a particular thing called the data import handler that's available since CF10. That's only an enterprise. And then for those into cryptology, encryption, there are certain algorithms that are RSA FIPS 140 compliant that are only in enterprise, and they're algorithms on the encrypt and decrypt and hash. And I'll leave you to look into those because I found the docs to be kind of inconsistent in those 3 different CFML references for those 3 different things. But the point is there's a handful of encryption algorithms that are specifically regarded as of this type, and they're only available in enterprise. If you try to use them, they won't work otherwise. And just see the docs for those details. All right, so at this point, you might think, well, it's not too many differences, about 13, but we're not done. We're not done. Let's keep going. You should know about things that are limited in standard, but that are not limited in enterprise, right? So they're not functional differences that you'll notice when you try to use them, or not all those other things. You couldn't use them if you're in a standard, but these things you can use them, but they're limited in ways that might surprise you. And the biggest surprise of all for most people is this thing called the Enterprise Feature Router, EFR. What's that about? Well, in CF8, Adobe, or back then Macromedia, made the decision to, it might have been, I can't remember, but anyway, they made the decision to allow all functionality to work in standard and enterprise. But they implemented a limiter for some, not all, but, and not even many, but for some tags. Here's the deal. And they're listed in the buying guide. You can see this documented. They call them restricted. They don't list them by tag, but they list it by functionality. For my checking into things, it looks like it's these. And there might be a couple I'm missing. If anybody knows, jump in. But check it out, because you probably use CF document. Many people do. Or CF PDF, or CF PDF form, or CF HTML to PDF, which kind of supplanted CF document since CF11, but CF document still supported. CF HTML to PDF, same concept, works very differently, but the point is, it too is restricted by the EFR. CF spreadsheet, CF print, CF presentation. And the functions that underlie these things, I should have added that, because it's not just about the tags, it's about the features. All right, so what's the deal? Check this out. Only one request at a time can run such a limited thing. So if somebody's running a CF document that's taking a long time, that CF document, let's say it takes a minute to run, somebody else tries to run a CF document, another request, another page, another app, doesn't matter. They try to run another page that does a CF document, they're going to wait. Anybody wanting to run that tag while it's already being run by somebody else is going to wait, be queued until the first one is done, right? Holy smokes. Now, if you know about stack tracing with tools like Fusion Reactor or the Server Monitor or PMT or CFusion or Java tools, if you stack traced a request while it was in that waiting state, you would see it says literally that it's in this ColdFusion Feature Router Edition, Standard Server Edition, Acquire Enterprise Feature Lock, and then it says it's locked on that. Well, all I'm telling you is that that would be proof. If you saw a request running slow and you thought, man, why are all these requests running slow? And you had a good tool that could show you the stack trace, you'd go, oh, it's waiting for another one. And so somewhere else in the list of running requests is another one that's doing the thing that this is waiting for, and it's going to wait. And this is shocking because a lot of people have no idea this is true. I've been telling people for years, but where do you get the word out? So that's another reason why I wanted to do this talk. For some people, this may be the reason, and perhaps the other ones add up to it, to move to enterprise, because that's a killer. Now, of course, I know some people go, well, that's the reason why I moved off of ColdFusion. I get it. But I'm talking to people who use ColdFusion, choose to, want to, have to, whatever. I'm saying if you're running ColdFusion Standard, and if you use diagnostic tools, and I can help you with that, I've done lots of talks on that, you can see this is what's happening. Requests are hung in this state of waiting for another request, when of course the real solution is find that request that's taking a long time and fix it. Maybe it's calling out to a database and the database is not responding. Well, that's going to lead to a cascading effect. Or maybe it's doing a CF-HTTP out to a server somewhere and it's not responding. Again, there's root cause problems to be solved. I get it. But if you don't want to be subject to this problem, well, enterprise doesn't have this problem. It doesn't have these limits. And for some people, that has been reason enough for them to go to enterprise. And I'm going to tell you more reasons in a moment, and you might suddenly realize, you know what? It is worth it. And it might actually save us money. Not just save our bacon, but save us money. We'll get to that in a second. But again, this has been a real gotcha. And I wanted to demo it, but we're running out of time. I think I've made my point. We're going to leave it at that. I wish I had time, but I want to skip on. So there's also administrator and configuration-oriented limitations to be aware of. One is on the request tuning page in the administrator. In standard, there's one box at the top. It's called maximum simultaneous requests, and it's the limit of the maximum number of requests that can run at one time. And once more than that many are running, the rest get queued. Now, just quickly, let's just say you had a problem with the CF document that locked up, and then suddenly a bunch of other people were doing CF documents and they're locking up. Well, in different versions of CF, this maximum simultaneous requests, maybe it's been 10, maybe it's been 25, maybe it's been 50, you might have changed it, it could be 100, 500. The point is, once that number of requests are running, any beyond that get queued up. They have to wait, and they wait in a different kind of queue state. Again, this is not the talk to get into that, but the point is they get queued waiting for a slot to open up, basically, right? So usually you don't hit this limit because this is only normally when things go bad. Suddenly requests are taking a long time. Hopefully that's not going to happen to you, but when it does happen, this simultaneous request limit says once this many requests are running, don't let any more run until slots open up to allow them to run. It's a good thing. Well, in enterprise, that same page has a couple more checkboxes that are not grayed out, and they let you set limits for each different kind of request that's coming in. So there's one kind of limit for regular CFM pages. There's another kind of limit for CFC calls coming into the server. Hear me, stop if you got distracted. This has nothing to do with CFCs you invoke within your CFML with CF invoke or create object or CF object or other implicit invocation mechanisms. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying if a request comes in as an HTTP call to your server, not asking for a CFM, but asking for a CFC. The point is you can do that. You could say question mark method equals something. You could say question mark WSDL and it would be a web service. And actually those are handled separately. I'll show you that in a second. But the point is CFC requests coming in as HTTP, they could have a number that they're allowed to run. And if you had flash remoting, which isn't used much anymore, but if you did, you could limit them to have their certain number. And then finally, incoming web services has nothing to do with outgoing requests. Incoming web services, you could say how many of them are allowed to run. All right. So these four settings are only in enterprise or developer or trial to be able to control how many of these four different types. It's kind of like having HOV lanes if you're from a city where you have that concept. Certain kinds of cars can be in one lane of traffic and go flying by even while other kinds of cars are sitting in traffic. So anyway, then CF thread, if you use CF thread, that's a tag that's interesting and it's got a script equivalent. If you use CF thread on the same page in the administrator, there's a limit in standard of 10 concurrent running CF thread threads. Once you try to run more than that, the rest get queued. And again, this could be a surprise in this problem because you don't really see CF threads normally. In fact, just last week, Fusion Reactor 8.5 came out and adds the ability to monitor threads. And the PMT offers the ability to monitor threads. The server monitor did as well, but I think only if you turned on profiling. But the point is, a lot of people don't have any tool that tells them what's going on with threads, and they may not realize that they're hitting this limit of 10 threads. Now you can set the number in the admin, but the point is the biggest number you can pick is 10. And once more than 10 threads are running, and let's say a thread is doing a CF document, well, now another thread tries to do it, it's going to be held up for the same reason. So this stuff does all pile up, and it might be that these things could be problems. Well, Enterprise doesn't have any such limit at all. You can run as many threads as you want. All right, so let's move on. Some surprises that might be significant to you. So check this out. This is not things that are in Enterprise only. This is things that are no longer Enterprise only. So this is important. If you're on standard, there may be things you've not used because you've been around CF long enough, or you've learned from somebody that's been around long enough, or you read something that was old, that was wrong, in that it's changed. So let's talk about that. The ColdFusion archive feature, the CAR mechanism, since CF 11 and above, that's in standard. So yeah, if you've got to migrate settings from one server to another, the CAR mechanism's awesome. And I did a whole talk on this and other sorts of migration features in CF back last month. So if you're interested in that, check out the recordings.coldfusionmeetup.com. The security sandbox feature, check this out. Some people don't even know this exists. That has been standard. Sorry, that should say now in standard. Let me go correct that because I don't want to leave a gross mistake like that. Cool. So that's the security sandbox feature is now in standard since CF11. Prior to 11, standard offered something called resource security, which was an instance-wide similar feature. Now, again, I don't have time in this talk to get into it. We could really do a whole session on it, but I'll leave you to learn more about it. It's a very powerful way to limit what the CF pages, CFM, CFCs in a particular folder are allowed to do. What other folders can they access? What data sources can they use? What websites can they access? What ports can they use? It's really powerful. It's called the security sandbox, but it wasn't in standard until 11. Well, if that sounds intriguing, check it out. And it's worthy of another talk because there's some gotchas that you need to be aware of when you turn it on. You have to open up more things than you probably think you do. But anyway, leave that for another day. Anyway, and you can find stuff on it if you just Google it. You'll find people having talked about it, or again, reach out to me. I help people do stuff like that all the time. Moving on, the CF administrator has long had what's called a user manager to let you create multiple administrator users. Doesn't have to all be the one user. Bob could have a username and password, and Sally can have a username and password. So yes, you could do that. And if you use RDS, which you shouldn't use in production, but if you use RDS in a central development environment for some reason, you could have different RDS users with different usernames and passwords. And with the sandbox, you can say what they're allowed to do also. It's really powerful stuff. Anyway, that's now in standard. That's now in standard since CF9. So again, people sometimes don't know about these things because they grew up in a world where they weren't available in standard and they just never paid attention to them. So pay attention to them. It might be something that really benefits you. And I wrote an article on this feature, I don't know, 10 years ago. It's really hasn't changed. Now, monitoring. The server monitor, the ColdFusion server monitor, was enterprise only from CF8 through CF 2016. Now CF 2018 offers what's called the PMT in both standard and enterprise. So this is no longer an issue at all, but I'm saying if you're still on 2016 or 11 or 10, the server monitoring was enterprise only, but it isn't anymore. And some other mail server configuration stuff, like I said, I've seen previously people assert and docs assert that these backup mail servers and maintain connection features are not in standard, but I looked in my CF 2018 standard and they were there. So I'm going to assert they're no longer enterprise only. Okay, WebSockets. When they first came out, they were limited to 5 sockets. I think there was even a time when they were limited to 2 sockets in standard. Then it was raised to 100. And then since CF11, there's now no limits on WebSockets. Now, again, I bring this up to say there are people that you might talk to who will say, yeah, well, that's another one of these things about ColdFusion. They hold back something like WebSockets. Can't do more than 100. That's crazy. All right, that was prior to 2014. Since 2014, it's not held back. Let's our news up to date, folks. HTML5 charting, when that first came out, it was indicated to be enterprise only when CF10 was released. So you might find stuff that asserts that. But soon after it was released, they realized, no, shouldn't have done that. And then it's not enterprise only. Not a big deal, but I just want you to be aware. And similarly, this is maybe old news, but I still want to make the point. Prior to CF9, so basically CF8, when CF8 added 64-bit support, you had to be on enterprise to use it. So if anybody still believes you have to be on enterprise to use 64-bit, no, that was lifted after CF9, from CF9 forward. And of course, CF 2018 doesn't support 32-bit anymore. And then enterprise gateways, they are now available to anybody in standard since CF8. They are subject to some thread limitations, and I don't know why I didn't list that somewhere, but it's true. They are limited, but they're not enterprise only. All the enterprise gateway types. There's multiple types, and there was a time when only a few of them were in standard and others were not. Now they're all available. That was my point. All right, another thing I want you to be aware of, things that you or others might think are enterprise only, but they're not. So clustered scheduled tasks. You might not even know this is there, but there's a feature in ColdFusion Enterprise when you set up scheduled tasks. You can cluster scheduled tasks, which means you could have two different machines that are even technically separate from each other, separate instances, separate machines. They point to a database that you define in the scheduled task clustering mechanism. You point to a database, and if they're both pointing to the same database, well, now if you say a task should be clustered, it means that only one of the instances will run that task. The other one will go, oh, I see you got that. I'll let it go. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. All right, so that's nice. Well, that's not enterprise. You see the word clustered and you think that's enterprise. No, it's not. Anybody can do it. And I mentioned this before, storing session variables in this distributed Redis storage. Yes, you could use a distributed Redis storage to store the session variables. That's available in standard. It's not just enterprise. And then the backup mail servers that I mentioned before. There are also things that are listed as enterprise only, but I did find them in standard. So I've seen this assertion that for scheduled tasks, the ability to do misfire and exception handling and listeners and chaining and application-specific tasks, I found those are all available in standard. So I don't know if the docs are old and wrong, but just be aware of that. And mail configuration, I've said this now multiple times. I'll have to clean that up. Sorry about that. And then all event gateway types. And then also you'll see something, especially since CF, I think it was 2016, added archiving and redaction and sanitization and comments. And the assertion was that it was enterprise only, but I'm not finding that to be true. Now I could be wrong with that because I didn't get to fully test it, but check that out. I just want to put that out there in case that's true. And then finally, things that are listed as enterprise only, but I couldn't find it all. I don't know what they were talking about. So, and GC, you're here. No, you do WebSockets. But if Adam's here, or anybody that does ColdFusion REST, there's a concept they list in the docs in multiple places called multi-site RESTful services. And I couldn't find any admin setting that had anything to do with that. So maybe it's some implied feature, I don't know. But I just wanted to say that I couldn't find it. But if it is there, it's enterprise only. That's what the docs say. And then there's a concept they call PDFG cluster support. And that's the PDF service page of the CF admin that supports the CF HTML to PDF tag. Well, I found I was able to add multiple PDF service locations with different domain names. And it didn't say, no, you can't do that. You're on standard. So I don't know that that's truly enterprise, if it even exists. I couldn't find it listed as a feature anywhere. So moving on. And then finally, things that are found in enterprise, but they're not in the developer edition. I've mentioned a couple of them, I just want to repeat. The security code analyzer is not in developer. The mail server configuration options are not, those particular ones for high scalability, they're not in the enterprise edition. Now, nice matter, wrap up, hopefully getting nearly done, yep. Here's where I might be able to save you money. I had said in a tweet yesterday that running CF Enterprise might be able to save you money. That might have sounded like nonsense. Let me explain what I meant. So first of all, did you know that CF licensing is per core? Per core since 2016. And my question to you is, do you know how many cores you're running? Because that's going to indicate how many licenses you should have bought. Standard is licensed per 2 cores. Enterprise is licensed per 8 cores. So if you're running CF Standard on a 4-core machine, then technically, legally, you should have bought 2 standard licenses. And I know that you're going to like, what? Well, I'm just the messenger. I'm saying it's licensed per 2 cores. And if you have an 8-core machine, well, technically you should have bought 4 standard licenses. And the price of 4 standard licenses is more than the price of enterprise. Remember? So yeah, I'm just saying, if you want to be properly licensed, it might be that it'd be cheaper for you in some cases to literally run enterprise than to run standard. And if you think crap full of crap and where am I getting this stuff, it's from the ColdFusion end user licensing agreement, and it was in 2016 and it's in 2018. In the 2018 version in sections 3.1.1 and 3.1.2. I'll leave you to look into that. And look at the definition in section 1.5 of what they mean by core and what about VMs, all that's covered. So I'll leave you to look into that. And if you have questions, you should raise those with Adobe. Again, I'm just the messenger. I did do a post a couple years ago on finding the end user licensing agreement. And it's not difficult. It's built right into it's in the root of your ColdFusion directory. So it's right there on your computer. You can find it, or you can go on the web and I have links to finding that. All right. I knew there had to be a question. This is if you use their REST. Okay, so he's talking about the clustered multi-site clustering, multi-site RESTful. He says if you use their REST API paths and then it routes through their REST process. Wait, I don't know. This doesn't seem like this is about the multi-site RESTful feature. He's just talking about there is an issue with REST, and yes, that was changed in 2018. Prior to, actually, it might have even been 2016, but anyway, certainly in 2018, the /API is no longer reserved by Adobe. They used a new virtual directory, but REST is there, and you can change that. There is a way to change it to not be REST, but that I found was in both standard and enterprise. It's an admin feature at the bottom of the page for REST services. You can change the URL. Anyway, moving back to this. So I thought maybe somebody would have a question or comment about the licensing, but let's move on. Development, staging, and testing servers. Check this out. This is both good news and maybe bad news. So back in CF9, Adobe changed their policy to allow production license keys to be used on staging, test, or shared development machines. That was really cool news. Terry Ryan wrote a blog post about it, and it was quite popular, and there was rejoicing all around. So that meant you didn't have to buy a license to do staging or development, shared development, or testing. And today, still, people buy CF licenses for development, test, and staging when they may not need to. So here's another example where you could maybe save money by having heard what I've said today, but there's something to be aware of. Since CF 2016, Adobe tightened up that freedom, and it's in section 3.2 of the EULA. We'll check out what it says. It says for each enterprise license, you get the right to install and use the software as development, meaning, and they have the definition of development, testing, and shared development. But for standard, it says you have to have obtained more than one standard to be able to use one such license for development. So it's a little more restricted. You have to have bought more than one. Again, if you bought 2 licenses for one 4-core machine, they're saying if you do that, then you can count one of those licenses to use against a development machine or staging machine. So it's pretty cool stuff. It's not terrible, but it's not as good as it used to be. And see this section for what they mean by development software regarding testing, development, and staging purposes to be used and accessed by authorized users over the licensee's internal network. So technically that does mean you're not supposed to be using this to provide access to people over the web, even though you call it staging. That's not good enough. They're saying it should only be accessed through your internal network, the model of the license. So again, I'm not a lawyer. You can read about this stuff. Just make sure that you need to be buying a license for dev, staging, and test. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. That's my point. And then Docker image, I'm sorry, I'm running over just a little bit. Give me a couple minutes, we'll be done. Adobe's offered CF Docker images for CF 2016 and 2018 for 2 years, 3 years now, since 2017. The license is odd. This is a quote from a page, I'll show you the link in a moment. It says, for enterprise, you can run 8 containers per enterprise license. And then for standard, every containerized deployment needs to be licensed. The wording is weird. It kind of implies it almost implies you have to have a license for each container, which I find hard to believe, but that's what they're saying, right? So I'll leave you to do further investigation into that. I'd strongly, obviously, in favor. Maybe it'll change in 2020. They're not announcing anything like that. But here's the key point about the Docker images. They're free for development. Most people are not using Docker for production. Some are, but most are not. So knock yourself out. Use the Docker images for development, for all the cool stuff you can do with Docker. It's free. And I did a blog post on this licensing, and I give you the links to where I got that information. So it's still there today. And then finally, builder licensing. One more bonus way that you might save money. Did you know that with every purchase of CF, you get CFBuilder for free? You get 3 CFBuilder licenses with Enterprise, and you get 1 with Standard. And you can read that in their FAQ about that. Now, I get it. You may be no fan of CFBuilder. I talked earlier about how you might want to use it just to do the security code analyzer, but check this out. Adobe has announced plans to recreate Builder atop VS Code. Yes, you heard me right. If you weren't mentioned, maybe VS Code caught your attention. I get it. You don't like CFBuilder running on Eclipse. You don't use it. Fine. They're working on a new VS Code implementation of CFBuilder, and there's not much more detail about it. My understanding is it'll be both available as an extension and as a packaged variation, just like they did with Builder. There was the Eclipse extension, or there was a packaged thing called CFBuilder. That's what I've heard, but man, no announcements yet. All right, so with that, I counted about 20 differences. So let's wrap up. Do you have to buy enterprise license to get enterprise only feature? Well, not necessarily, certainly for development and test, and maybe even production. Developers free, of course, offers nearly everything. It's limited only in terms of number of IPs that can make requests until a restart. And it's not to be used in production. Don't use development for production. That's against the rules. The trial edition does last for 30 days. It's identical to enterprise, but it's not supposed to be used for production. If you read the EULA, that's what it says. But I also want to point out, don't forget that hosting companies are out there. ColdFusion hosting companies exist, and they offer standard or enterprise. They might offer it as shared hosting, as a VPS, by Docker, whatever. The point is, you don't have to pay Adobe to use ColdFusion. You could pay a hosting company, and they pay Adobe. And you might be shocked to find that the prices are not very high. And then finally, if you didn't know it, Adobe offers an Amazon AMI, Amazon Machine Image, where you pay by the hour. And that, for some people, has turned out to be cheaper or just more cost effective in various ways than buying the enterprise license. And it is an enterprise license in the AMI by default. All right, so I just wanted to point that out. You don't technically have to buy an enterprise license to get these enterprise only features. So how would you find all these differences? Well, there are various resources out there that do make these distinctions. Perhaps the most important one is the buying guide. And there's different things that have buying guide in their name. That particular one plainly lists what's in enterprise versus standard as of CF 2018. So if you wanted something to back up what I've said or to show to somebody without having to watch a whole talk, point them to that URL. It's mostly accurate. I've found some inconsistencies, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There's also the buying guide for enterprise. It's a different thing. And a buying guide for standard. It's a different thing. So sometimes they say the same thing. Sometimes they're slightly different. The point is, they're there. There's also a PDF called the buying guide. And despite the name, it's a different guide, and it covers CF 2018. So technically, one should look at all those, and I did, trust me, and that's what led to this presentation. There's also a support matrix, and it focuses on the differences from the OS and DB level. It's what said Solaris is only an enterprise, and it and other places say that DB2, Oracle, and Sybase are only an enterprise. Again, my point here is that they're not always consistent. They're not quite accurate from a testing I've done, and maybe just not up to date. So be aware of that. That's a bummer. That's why another reason why I did this talk. And I plan to create bug reports reporting these things, maybe a blog post identifying the variations to help Adobe, and until then, other folks who are interested to see those differences from my perspective. All right, in summary, sorry, we're just a few minutes over. There's a lot more to the differences than most would think, right? That was my point. And the key features that are unique to enterprise are mostly scalability from interesting clustering, load balancing, session replication, the ERWAR deployment, the API manager and all of its abilities, the security code analyzer, which I still think should be in standard, the distributed caching feature, the high volume mail sending, the server monitor if you're on CF 2016 or earlier. If you want that, you have to be on enterprise. Fortunately, that's been fixed in 2018 with PMT. And of course, Fusion Reactor and CFusion work on both editions of ColdFusion. They don't care. And then these DB drivers that I've mentioned a couple times, and the cluster support for WebSockets. And then there's still more advantages, we could say. The ORM search, the enhancement schedule tasks, the encryption additions, the PDF, DDX, the lifting of limitations in the AFR, it's just gone if you're on enterprise, the lifting of limits on threads and types of request threads. And then those bonuses about cores and license counts for dev and test and Docker and CFBuilder. It's really quite a lot. And then remember we said some things that were enterprise only now no longer are, and alternatives do exist. And I've shown some of those that you can use with either standard or Lucee. And don't forget that 25% discounted price for upgrades from CF 9, 10, or 11 at buycf.com. Whew. So with that, I hope you learned a lot today. You guys have asked questions. I think I've answered all of them as we went. I was keeping an eye on it. If anybody has any other questions or comments, feel free to share it. If you got to get going, I understand. And we will announce another session for the meetup next week. It's going to be a very interesting and different one than anything we've done before. Look for that to come soon. So with that, I'll say thank you. And I don't have anything else to turn to, so I'll just leave this here. Again, you can follow up afterwards in the bottom right corner at my email address or Twitter account. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Some are sending me privately, some are sending publicly. Thanks so far for the kind regards. No negative ones yet, but you can send them privately or publicly. Any feedback, and also you can send me feedback via the email and Twitter, of course. Anybody have any questions that are outstanding? And if you're typing one, you might want to type a little, yeah, wait, and then type your long question. Because if I don't hear from anybody in the next 30 seconds, I'll conclude. There's no outstanding questions. And I've done my job. Okay, doesn't seem to be anybody saying wait, and nobody, I mean, I can't see who's typing, so we'll go ahead and call it at this point. So I'll stop the recording and we will catch up with everybody next time. Till again.